and welcome to the full version of my 1/72nd scale Bf-109 F-4 R1 build from AZ Models. In this video I'll cover building this kit as well as doing a German splinter camouflage and mottling with an airbrush, doing a bit of enamel and oil paint weathering, and at the very end I'll give my thoughts on this kit and how it compares to the other 109s I've previously built. So without further ado, let's get into this one. To begin with, I gave all of the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to clean them up, and once they'd dried, I began cutting out the parts with my sprue cutters, starting with the cockpit floor, fuselage halves, instrument panel, front bulkhead, the various smaller cockpit details, and the exhausts. I planned to paint the radiator flaps and landing gear on the sprue, so I cut their section of framework out, and continued cutting out the wings and the propeller components. Any seam lines, flash or sprue points were then carefully sanded away using various files or sanding sticks. Once cleaned up, I then glued the seat tub to the cockpit floor, followed by the rudder pedals, which was a little bit fiddly but added some nice detail. After some cleanup with a knife, the cannon cover was glued to the front bulkhead, and then I glued it along with the joystick to the cockpit floor. To make sure the cockpit parts fitted, I placed them in the fuselage halves while they were drying to help line them up. Satisfied with the fit, I then glued the instrument panel to the bulkhead and sat the cockpit parts aside. I glued the propeller to its base piece and then fitted the spinner and added a washer to lock the propeller in place. Interestingly, the propeller lock is not mentioned in the instructions, but I added it since I like to rotate my propellers for stop motions, although this was a very fragile assembly and actually ended up falling apart later on. The struts were then glued to the landing gear bay doors so they could be painted together, and I assembled the wings by gluing the lower wing to both of the upper wing halves. For this, I first applied my normal glue of choice, which is Revell Contactor Professional, out of a nozzle, followed by some Tamiya extra thin cement, which was applied along the seam lines using the applicator to reduce any of the gaps. The flap and trim wheels were then glued to the left side of the cockpit seat, but the fit for these parts was very tight. Once they were in place, I was now ready to do some interior painting, so I sprayed all of the sub-assemblies and parts I wanted to paint at this stage, including the landing gear bay and radiators, with some Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer to unify the surface and help the following layers of paint stick to the surface. I gave the primer around 12 hours to fully cure, and then painted the interior of the landing gear bay, the inner side of the landing gear doors, and the radiators with some Vallejo Model Air RLM2 Grey. For painting Vallejo Model Air colours, I find roughly a mid to high 20 psi and thinning them with around 1 part Vallejo acrylic flow improver and 1 part paint seem to work pretty well, though I still mess around and experiment with them and do find that some paints vary. I considered using RLM02 for the interior of the cockpit as well, but decided instead to go with RLM66 Dark Grey, as this became the new standard cockpit colour when the F models came into production, though I wouldn't be surprised if some of them were still painted in this earlier cockpit colour. Once the RLM66 had dried, I began picking out the cockpit's various moulded details, starting with some Vallejo model colour flat yellow for the fuel lines, some of the engine controls on the floor, and the throttles. Model colour flat black was then used for the base of the throttle, along with the handle of the joystick, and as a base colour for the fuse boxes on the right side of the fuselage. Initially I used Vallejo model colour medium blue for the oxygen's wiring and system, but this colour seemed too dark, so I would later change this. Model colour vermilion red was also used to pick out some various engine controls, as well as to paint the flap and trim wheels based on the instructions. I repainted the oxygen system with a much lighter sky blue, which I was happy with, and then painted the base of the control column and straps for the cannon cover with model colour saddle brown. If I made any mistakes while painting these finer details, I would touch up with a tiny bit of the RLM66. To lighten up the cover on the base of the control column, I then dry brushed it with some model colour light brown to give it a worn leather effect. Decals are included for the instrument dials, so with the painting done, I cut them out, stuck them in some water for a few seconds, and once they started to come loose of the paper, I dabbed some water onto the panel and then slid the decals into place. I then dabbed some Tamiya decal adhesive onto them and used a cocktail stick to help push the dials into the recessed details. The armoured headrest cushion was then painted with saddle brown in a few coats, and then I used a fine brush and some Model Air aluminium to dry brush some metal scratches and chipping on the sidewalls, heavily onto the seat and around the rudder pedals, and lightly in the landing gear bay and on the radiator doors. Just like with the joystick, I dry brushed some light brown onto the headrest cushion and did another coat on the joystick's base. After the chipping had dried, I then applied some Tamiya black panel accent over the entire of the cockpit and interior parts. This enamel panel wash flows into all of the recessed details, making them pop and giving a subtle grimy appearance. It also darkens the model a fair bit, so once it had dried, I used a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinners to gently rub away the excess and help it flow more into just the recessed details. In some parts of the cockpit things are pretty tight, so I ended up using a small synthetic brush dipped in the thinners instead to help move it around. Since the panel wash is enamel and the model colour paints are acrylic, this doesn't damage the paint underneath, which is really handy. After the wash and thinners had fully dried, I then removed a small bit of flash from the tail with a file, and then proceeded to glue the cockpit assembly to the right fuselage half. The fit of these parts was pretty good, so I then added the exhausts, which have to be added at this stage. A tiny bit of sprue had to be removed with a knife from them, but they went into place reasonably easy, though the shroud on one side did break off, so I had to glue it back into place. After taking a photo of the cockpit before it disappeared, I held the prop in place and ran a bead of Revell Contactor Professional along the right fuselage and joined the left side together. This kit has no guide pins, so it can be quite tricky to line the parts up, and some gaps were present. I used a bulldog clip and some masking tape to hold the fuselage halves together while they dried, and ran some Tamiya extra thin along the seam lines to once again strengthen the bond and melt the seam line down a bit, as I had done with the wings. Speaking of which, I glued the radiator flaps to the underside of the wing, and while the fuselage parts bonded together, I cut out the horizontal stabilizers, top part of the engine cowling, the two halves for the supercharger intake, and the barrel and gun pods for the 20mm cannons which were mounted under the wings. These parts were then cleaned up of any seam lines or excess sprue, and then I assembled the underwing 20mm cannon pods. Unfortunately, you can't leave the barrels off until after they'd been added, and one of my barrels did snap off and go missing, but fortunately I've done another AZ-109, so I had some spares. After a few hours, I removed the front tape and glued the engine cowling into place, followed by the supercharger intake, and fortunately both parts went on without any issues. The wings were then glued to the underside of the fuselage, and once in place, the seams were ran over again with the Tamiya extra thin, and I did the exact same technique while attaching the horizontal stabilizers. The front oil radiator was glued to the underside of the aircraft, along with the two 20mm cannon pods, and with that I'd assembled the aircraft as much as I'd planned to before painting it. There were still quite a few gaps however, so I began filling them in with some Vallejo water-based putty with a cocktail stick, and once in place I used a damp finger to wipe off the excess. I let the putty dry and then sanded all the seam lines down and rescored any lost panel lines, although it's worth noting that the 109 does actually have a seam line on the top of the rear fuselage, so you can leave a subtle gap in this area. I really should have done a more thorough job however in some spots, especially on the underside and front of the cowling, so I am making it a goal to spend more time on my models filling and sanding in future builds. To prepare the aircraft for painting, I masked off the landing gear bay and cockpit with some blue tack so I wouldn't paint over my hard work, and once this was in place, I primed the model with some Vallejo gloss black primer. This was mixed to a ratio of 2 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 3 drops of acrylic thinners, and 4 drops of primer. I sprayed the primer on gradually in short passes, building up slowly in layers until the upper surface was a solid gloss black. I then let the model dry for a few hours before turning it over and applying the gloss black primer on the underside in the same fashion. This was then left for 12 hours to cure before I would move on to painting. From my experience with the 190s I've done, I usually start with the yellow markings on Luftwaffe aircraft, so I masked off the edges where they'd be applied so that I'd prevent any overspray. I did a poll on YouTube and Patreon for which schemes you guys wanted to see me paint both the Airfix and AZ-109s in, and for this kit I'd be going with the second scheme that won, which was Black 1, featuring a very nice yellow nose. Initially, I painted these yellow areas with 5 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, mixed with 2 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners, 5 drops of Model Air Insignia white, and a single drop of Vallejo model colour vermilion red. Now, for anyone wondering why I started painting this 109 pink, it was not for breast cancer awareness like on a certain Qantas-8, but rather pink acts as a really great base colour for yellow, and once the pink had dried, I applied several layers of Model Air RLM4 yellow, and as you can see, with the pink as a base colour, this went on like a dream. I gave the yellow a few hours to fully cure, and then masked it off using the same tape I'd previously used to mask around it, along with some extra 3mm tape around the edges of the smaller tail band. With the yellow masked off, I then moved on to painting the lighter colour in the 3-tone camo, which would be RLM 65. Curiously, the instructions called for the mid-war RLM 76, 74 and 75 scheme, but on the box art and illustrations, it looked to me more like the Battle of Britain style RLM 65 with O2 grey and 71 for the wings and upper fuselage. I decided, since it was an early Bf-109F, to go with my eyes and paint it RLM 65, RLM 2 and RLM 71. I like to paint the lightest colour first, so I mixed 7 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 2 drops of AK interactive thinners, and then 4 drops of AK interactive RLM 65 1941 variant. I then sprayed this gradually in the middle of each panel line, and then filled in the edges, building it up in several layers until I had a reasonably uniform layer of RLM 65 blue on the underside of the aircraft, the sides of the fuselage, and on the tail. I'd used some post shading on a few recent projects and really liked the effect, so I did some on this model by mixing in some white with the RLM 65 and then spraying it very finely onto the middle of the panel lines and the fabric divots. I tried to create a little bit of subtle variation by applying it more heavily onto some panels to not only add extra depth and detail, but also create these variations where some panels might have been replaced, repainted, or even aged a little bit faster. After the RLM 65 had dried for a few hours, I then masked it off using some tape and moved on to painting the upper surface. I mixed up 6 drops of acrylic flow improver with 6 drops of Vallejo Model Air RLM02 grey, and then gradually sprayed this in the rough shapes of all of the lighter camouflage areas based on the colour guide. I did experience a small amount of tip drying, but overall this colour went on pretty well. Once again, I would do some post shading by mixing a similar ratio of the RLM02 and flow improver, but with a drop of Insignia white. This was sprayed into the middle of all of the panels to highlight them and give the paint a slightly faded effect in some areas. On some spots I also sprayed the lighter colour on a bit more heavily for some variation, though I found overall the effect was a bit too extreme. I then softened this post shading with another very light coat of solid RLM2 grey to darken the shapes, and then I was happy with the more subtle effect. I let the paint dry for a few hours, and so I could achieve a sharp splinter effect for the camouflage, I then used some 3mm masking tape to mask the edges of the RLM2 camouflage, and filled in the larger areas with some 9 and 18mm masking tape. 5 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 1 drop of AK interactive acrylic thinners, and 4 drops of AK interactive RLM71 were then mixed up for the darker green, and sprayed in light passes over the unmasked areas. Eventually the RLM71 was solid, so I once again did some post shading, but instead of white, I actually added a few drops of the RLM2, which produced a less extreme result. But I still ended up doing another light coat of RLM71 afterwards, just to keep the effect a bit more subtle. While the RLM71 cured, I then masked off part of the propeller and spinner, and sprayed it with a few coats of Insignia white, and once that dried, I masked it off and painted the rest of the propeller and its blades with a coat of RLM70. My masking was a little bit wonky, but I would later do some touch-ups with a brush. Next, I removed all of the masking tape, and I was pretty happy with the result. There were a few small areas that needed touching up with the RLM71, RLM65 and the yellow, just to straighten some of the lines and fix some spots I'd missed when masking, but for the most part the masking had worked out really well. The propeller received some flat white and RLM70 touch-ups using a fine brush, and once that had dried, I mixed 3 drops of acrylic flow improver, 2 drops of acrylic thinners, and 6 drops of gloss varnish, and sprayed this onto the model in several passes to build up a coat of gloss varnish. This would not only protect the paint job, which is vital when it comes to using less durable acrylic paints like I do, but it also creates a smooth surface for the decals which can prevent them from silvering. I sprayed both sides of the model and then left it aside so that the varnish could cure for around about 12 hours. Before I could add the decals, however, I would first need to add the mottling. To do this, I first masked off all of the edges of the camouflage, leaving just the fuselage sides, and then I mixed up 2 drops of acrylic flow improver and 3 drops of RLM2 grey. I sprayed this mix carefully on the sides to create some small random blotches of the lighter camouflage colour. Someone in the comments of one of my FW190 videos suggested I try removing the nozzle cover from my Hastings airbrush to get a finer result when modelling, so I decided to give this a try, and it definitely resulted in very fine shapes. However, I found the flow a bit inconsistent and I had a lot of tip drying, plus it was very awkward to aim, but I'm sure with practice and a little bit of retardant it would be a very good technique. Once dried, I then repeated the process with some AK Interactive RLM70, but it seemed to speckle a lot more than the Vallejo colours, but I was reluctant to thin the paint any further as I didn't want it to get even more runny and thin. While the painting guide indicated very fine mottling, mine turned out a bit larger and more soft than I would have liked. I was still pretty happy though with the results for a first attempt with no nozzle cover, and I'll definitely keep practicing this on future builds with a bit of retardant to try and stop the tip drying. The final step for the modelling was to then soften the effect using a thin layer of the AK Interactive RLM65 to blend everything together. Once that dried, I then removed the masking tape from the rest of the aircraft. I noticed a few small imperfections with the camouflage which may have been from the masking tape, so I had to once again use a fine brush to do a few touch-ups. Usually I have no problems, but I did notice a similar issue with the tape possibly lifting paint on my Italeri Mustang builds as well, which is a little bit strange since these are the only airbrush builds I've had that happened to so far. I'll make sure to ensure I give a few extra hours for the paint to not only dry but also cure, as well as the varnishes, before doing any more masking in future builds, but everything was fortunately not too noticeable once it was touched up. I then moved on to applying the decals next, although I probably should have applied a coat of gloss varnish over the modelling, but fortunately the main decals didn't silver at all. I applied the decals by first cutting the sheets into manageable sections and then sticking them in some warm water for about 20 seconds until they start to come loose of the paper. At that point, I then apply some water onto the model where I want to place them, and then I slide the decals off of the paper onto the model using a brush or in some cases my finger. The quality of the AZ decals were definitely not as good as Cartograph ones, and they were very thin and had a tendency to fold up, especially the super skinny wingway walk markings. However, there would be much worse. Unfortunately, the common stencils came on a separate sheet, and as you can see they were all pretty much useless. This seemed to be because the clear film seemed to be slightly offset from the actual ink, which meant that they weren't actually sealed in and unfortunately all disintegrated. Fortunately, some of the larger common stencils were still usable, like the fuel and engine placards, the no-push indicators on the control surfaces, the logo on the propeller blades, and what I believe is the red ground power and the blue oxygen refill access hatches, but this was still a bit of a disappointment. After all the surviving decals were in place, I then gave them a coat of Tamiya decal adhesive, followed by some Vallejo decal softener to help them soften and stick to the model's fine surface details, and then I set the model aside for another 12 hours to dry, and in the meantime painted the wheel covers with RLM65 to match the fuselage, the tail wheel with some RLM2, and the antenna with some RLM71. I did several coats of these colours, keeping the paint nice and thin, and building them up in layers. At around this time, I re-glued the kit's left underwing 20mm cannon barrel as I'd previously knocked it off, though I probably should have left this off until even later, as it would not be the first or last time that this happened. The tail wheel, tyre and main wheels were painted a few coats of Vallejo model colour flat black, and with these finer parts painted, I then cut them out, removed the blue tack masks from the wheel wells, and glued the main wheel well doors and struts into place. The main landing gear parts had very little contact to the wings and not much to lock them in place, so I ended up giving them a few minutes for the glue to dry and then tried attaching the wheels, but found in the end it was easier to glue the wheels to the main landing gear struts and then attach those to the wing. Once the wheels had been glued to the wings, I then set the model aside for them to dry for a few hours with no weight on them, and then after some small touch-ups, I finally mixed up 4 drops of acrylic flow improver with 8 drops of matte varnish into my airbrush, and sprayed the model in several light passes to build up a layer of varnish which would protect the mottling and decals, while also giving the previously glossy paint a more accurate dull finish. This process was repeated on the underside, and then I once again sat the kit aside for 12 hours for the varnish to cure, before moving on to some weathering. With the matte varnish now cured, I started with some metal chipping. This was created using my preferred method of some model air aluminium applied using a fine brush, after most of the wet paint had been dabbed off or wiped off the brush. I then dabbed this onto the areas of the model where I wanted to create some metal chipping, which was mainly on the walkway area and leading edges of the wing, the landing gear hub and doors, around the access hatches for the cowling, other moving parts like the flaps and metal edges near the controls, and on the propeller blades. These are parts that are all generally either exposed to crew, movement, dirt and debris, or air resistance, but reference photos are definitely great to have a look at. While the aluminium chipping dried, I painted the exhausts a base coat of Vallejo model colour gold, and once the aluminium had dried, I then mixed up some white with both RLM 65 as well as 71 and RLM 02, which were the camouflage colours, to create a lighter paint than the camouflage. These lighter colours were then used to create some additional chipping, this time more subtle lighter patches and scratches of paint, making it appear the paint had gradually worn off rather than just been stripped bare to the aluminium. You can also use these lighter colours to highlight raised details on fabric control surfaces, and soften the metal chipping effect by applying it over the top of it, making it more subtle and realistic for certain aircraft. The same technique of using aluminium and then a lighter version of the base colour was used to chip the spinner and propeller blades, along with applying some of the darker RLM 70 to make the white look a bit chipped and faded. With the chipping done, I then applied some heavily watered down Vallejo model colour dark rust onto the exhausts to weather and dull them down a bit, and once this dried, I'd got out some Tamiya black panel accent and applied it over all of the recessed panels and details on the upper surface, along the edges of the controls, and around the engine. This would create some post shading and also replicate a build-up of dirt and grime in the panel gaps. On the lighter undersides, I also used some brown enamel wash for a more subtle effect, as well as to try and replicate lighter grime such as oil coolant and dirt. As you can see, the effect is very extreme, so to tone this down and make sure the wash is mainly in the recesses, I then get a cotton bud and dip it in some X20 enamel thinners, and rub this over the entire model, as much as possible rubbing from nose to tail to streak any excess enamel wash in the direction air would push any leaks. With the enamel wash done, the next step in my weathering process was to add some oil paints. I squeezed a drop of Epsilon 502 flat black along with some engine grime, white, buff and flat earth oil paints onto a piece of cardboard and left them aside for 2 hours for the excess oil to leak out of the paints. After the 2 hours, I then reactivated some of the engine grime and black using AK Interactive odorless thinners, and I used a small brush to dab it onto the exhausts, along the sides of the fuselage and the top part of the wing based on references to create some exhaust stains. I also added a tiny bit around the base of the 20mm cannon pods for some gun smoke. The dabs were then streaked and blended using a larger brush and some odorless thinners, and then I applied some of the odorless thinners onto the underside of the aircraft and used the fine brush to add some small streaks of oil, grease and coolant around the radiators, the landing gear and the fuselage based on reference photos. The flat earth and buff oil paints were then used on the landing gear bay doors, the underside of the wings, the base of the rudder, and on the wheels to create a build-up of dried mud and dirt, as if the aircraft had been operating out of rough grass airstrips on the Russian steppes. I spent time building up the layers and then softening the excess with the thinners and then repeating until I was happy with the effect. I also used the odorless thinners to feather down the edges of some of the oil paints until I had a nice soft effect where I was happy with it. With the oil weathering finished, the aircraft was pretty much ready for the last of its final details. One of the wheels had come off during the weathering process, but I decided to leave it off temporarily while I painted both the nav lights and part of the landing gear shock with some Model Air RLM01 silver. This would replicate the bare shiny metal on the struts and also act as a base colour for the nav lights. Unfortunately, the propeller also snapped off its lock during this stage, so I ended up having to secure it on with some blue tack so that I could still rotate the propeller if I wanted to. Next, I got out the armoured headrest, add-on armour glass, and the canopy, and used a bit of microsec crystal clear to glue the add-on armour to the front of the canopy. The crystal clear is a bit like a sort of PVA glue that glues plastic pretty well and dries clear, although I did find that it left a few tide marks. The 20mm cannon was also repaired along with the rogue wheel, and once the antenna had been added to the canopy, I then glued the canopy's armoured headrest using some deluxe material rocket odorless CA glue. The kit's included gun sight was then glued to the instrument panel, and after a quick test fit, I then glued the control balances to the wings. Unfortunately, I lost one of the kit's originals, but fortunately the Eduard 109, which I'll be building soon, actually has several spares, so I ended up using one from that kit. The cannons and machine guns, which were still on the sprue, received a coat of Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic, and after some adjustments to the gun sight, I started painting the canopy frames. First with 2 coats of RLM66 to replicate the interior colour, and then with some RLM71 to match the external camouflage colour. Since I'd used AK and Vallejo acrylic paints, the paint could be gently scratched off to neaten the framework up, which I find much easier than masking the canopy up, as long as you scratch gently and before the paint has had too long to cure to avoid having any scratches or paint that's too difficult to remove. The nav lights were then painted using Tamiya clear red on the left side and clear green on the right, which produces a nice effect when applied over the silver from earlier. The machine guns were cut out and then glued to the cowling, and then I used some AK pigment fixer and some Humroll black pigments to try and replicate some gun smoke on the barrels, although I probably need to work on this technique a bit more as I wasn't really happy with the results. And the last details to add to the aircraft were the rigging wires. I used my typical duo of AK Interactive's mega thin rigging wire, glued in place with Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue. First I glue the larger antenna to the mast, then stretch it to the tail, cutting away the excess once that has been glued to the tail, and then I add the smaller wire leading to the fuselage. I've seen various ways that the smaller antenna is attached to the aircraft's fuselage, so I decided to go with what the marking guide illustrated to position the wire. The final thing to do was to paint the control balances with some RLM65 to match the underside of the fuselage, and with that, my AZ Models Bf109 F4/R1 was finally completed. And here you can see the finished model. So starting off with the negative points, I probably did the underside streaks and stains a little bit too heavily, but that's something I can easily tone back and something I plan to do on my next 109 builds. I'm super happy with how the masking and the mottling turned out. I think it's probably one of my best paint jobs to date. Although since building this one, I have dug a little deeper and it seems unlikely the 109Fs ever actually used the early war colours I used in this scheme, as it was apparently phased out with the end of E model production. Looking at Eduard's various releases of F models featuring similar schemes, they all seem to be with the mid-war colours, but I really like the look of the early colours on this aircraft, and it's not an entirely impossible scheme. It could have been that a factory had old paint stocks, or perhaps a unit in the field decided to repaint their aircraft. This seemed to happen quite often in some Luftwaffe units, and could give me an excuse as to why some of these small common stencils are not applied. The kit itself is definitely more detailed than the Airfix Italeri and old Hella 109s I've previously built, though definitely not as precise fitting as any of those kits, with a lot of fragile joints for the landing gear, no guide pins in most places, and a bit more sanding and filling required. And of course, there was the unfortunate case that a lot of those common stencils were unusable in this kit. I don't recall having the common stencils in the last AZ model I built have this happen, so hopefully this was just a bad batch of decals, but obviously this is still not good. I think as well as improving on their decals, AZ should have really done a 3-piece canopy so that you could have it open, as there's no pilot figure, and it would be nice given the incredible cockpit detail they've managed to mould with the plastic. Nevertheless, I still thoroughly enjoyed building this kit, and so far the AZ-109 has proven to be one of my favourite kits of the type in 1/72nd scale for a more detailed build with a lot of different schemes available in various boxings. The price can vary depending on which issue of 109 you're getting, but in general they range from around 25 to 35 AUD, which seems reasonable enough given their level of detail. I would definitely recommend this kit to a more experienced modeler. Overall, I'm really happy with how this kit turned out and the results I achieved, and I very much look forward to applying what I've learnt to the next 109s I do in the future. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel as it really helps out. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the time I spend making these videos and the products I use to make them. Without you guys, I couldn't make all of these videos, so I really appreciate the support. And if you want to join my patrons, then I'll leave a link to my Patreon page in the description below. I'm really looking forward to starting the WWII 109 really soon, and I'm hoping I'll be able to apply what I've learnt in all of these previous builds and get a really good result, and maybe tone it down even further on the weathering and see how it goes. After that, I'll probably look at doing some inbox reviews and builds of earlier E models, since we haven't really looked at too many on the channel, and you know me, I really love my 109s. So that's it for now, but thanks again for watching, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.